Hello, I'm Stephen Michael, the co-executive director of Business Education Fund and Main Street Alliance. Since 2008, we've been working directly with small businesses across the country to re-envision our economy, particularly the ways in which we can call for government to better support small businesses and the communities they serve. Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion around our recently released report, The Role of Government, a Small Business Perspective. COVID-19 exposed tears in our social safety nets and highlighted the extreme disconnect between what many policymakers believe about our communities, small businesses, and the economy, and the on-the-ground reality. This created an opportunity and an opening unlike ever before to educate decision makers and the public about what small businesses really need to thrive. Research and continued engagement with small businesses conducted through this critical moment in our country's history has allowed us to identify a few key steps that we believe are necessary to move forward from this moment. I'm going to quickly run through some of the top lines and themes from our report, but encourage you to download it and read it through fully if you have not done so already. The basis for this report was a cross-issue poll commissioned by Business Education Fund, Main Street Alliance, and several of our partners, including Color of Change, Healthcare for America Now, Americans for Tax Fairness, and others. The poll was conducted by Lake Research Partners from August 31st to September 16th, 2020. It reached 600 small business owners with an oversample of 100 Black small business owners and 100 Latinx or Asian American or Pacific Islander small business owners. Over the fall of 2020, we hosted a series of events on specific data within the poll, which looked at COVID relief, access to capital, healthcare, taxes, and more. But we wanted to dig a little deeper on this core finding that 67% of small business owners believe that there's a role for government to play in protecting small businesses and creating a more equitable economy. We want to know more about what this meant. And in a period of such polarization and divisiveness, this really seemed to be a unifying idea, with support running across race, gender, age, party identification, geography, business size, and sector. To us, this really presented an exciting opportunity to build unity and is one key way to move forward as a country. I'll walk through some high-level findings with this context in mind. Small businesses are the most trusted institution in the country, according to Gallup. And if we can rebuild our economy with small business at the center, we can also address the fractures in the social infrastructure that deepened systemic disparities over the last year. Focusing on these common experiences identified through the poll, we sought to contextualize our understanding through this lens of high-road small businesses of varying backgrounds. We identified key members within our network based on background, including business size, location, industry, race, and gender. Interviews covered experiences with COVID relief and their observations on government support for very small business owners in a thriving and equitable small business sector. In these open-ended conversations, we asked small business owners to share their impressions of the poll results, relate how their experiences with COVID relief has shaped their views on government, identified ways in which government programs had succeeded or failed them and other small business owners, and what it would take to close the gap between that identifying the needs of small businesses and government action. 4 key themes emerged from these conversations. One is a support for small businesses is important, and government should do more to make assistance effective and equitable. 2, COVID really revealed the lack of public infrastructure for protecting small businesses and the systemic disenfranchisement or systemic disinvestment in BIPOC business owners and very small businesses overall. 3, COVID really was a turning point for many small business owners, and one marked by outrage, anger, and action. And 4, really the crisis is not over. There is still a need for relief now, as well as a need for significant long-term reinvestment. The poll and the interviews really made this clear. The interviews ended up providing some more context for how we might begin to move forward from this moment, really identifying the opportunities for government to play a bigger role. We know that it's going to require investment in policy change that truly reckons with the failures of our infrastructure and public investments up to this point, especially addressing inequities. And changes must be informed by those who are most impacted. Overall, we must invest in public infrastructure necessary to sustain a vibrant small business economy. Things like making capital available readily, equitably, and efficiently, being proactive and having regular communication and dialogue about programs, supporting small businesses with key functions like accounting and taxes, legal support, and placing small businesses at the center of economic development. We must design this infrastructure in collaboration with very small business owners, particularly BIPOC business owners, again, centering those most impacted by this work. But through this study, it became clear that we need to know more. We need to know more in order to equitably move these policies forward. As we learned through COVID, operating on the assumptions of what we think we know about small businesses is dangerous. It matters which government agency is involved in delivering certain programming, and even which methods that one agency chooses to work through. I mean, looking at the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant versus the PPP versus the EIDL program versus the Restaurant Revitalization Fund is just one example. Also really thinking about long-term challenges that have been, ongoing for small businesses, like interactions dealing with the IRS. We need to dig more into how to overhaul the banking system and capital lending systems to ensure equity and address existing systemic racism and sexism in those systems. As we look forward to the future, we need to be better prepared. If COVID is going to cycle like the flu, how do we put in permanent emergency measures in place that reduce volatility? How do we protect those who became entrepreneurs during the pandemic because they lost their jobs or couldn't manage their schedule due to childcare needs or other things? How do we keep this from happening in the future? Will social programs be enough? What steps must be taken to ensure that we can build an equitable, inclusive, and resilient economy? Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Don Lee of the LA Times. Don covers the U.S. and global economy out of Washington, D.C., and will lead us in a conversation with policy experts and small business owners to dig into some of these questions. Don?
Thanks, Stephen. Happy to be with you and have a really diverse and experienced group of panelists, and just want to take a minute to introduce them to you. First, Didier Trin is the Government Affairs Director at Main Street Alliance. Joe Perilla is a fellow and researcher at the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program. Olay Hongbathong is a business owner. He owns Olay, aptly named. It's a photography business located in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And Natasha Crosby is a realtor and president of the LGBTQ Richmond Chamber of Commerce. So welcome to all the panelists. I'll start us off by referring back to Stephen's summary of the report. And I think it was quite revealing because we tend to think of small businesses as fiercely independent and want to do things by themselves and go at it alone. And yet, that's not exactly what the report found either. And so what are your initial reactions, first of all, to the report? Just open it up to anyone who wants to offer their thoughts.
I think my initial reaction to the report is that this is something that true small businesses have been well aware of for a long time, being those who have been left out and having such a negative reaction to COVID is really something that we all know is true. And so we want to bring this message out to more and more people so that we know moving forward that centering true small business owners, BIPOC small business owners is truly the way forward.
I was struck by really two things. One, I thought the poll did a nice job of reinforcing the importance of the public sector during a crisis, but the way that the crisis showed a spotlight on existing systemic challenges in terms of connecting small businesses to capital and practical assistance was certainly a wake-up call. I think policymakers, business leaders, people running financial institutions underestimated the implications of the shift in the wake of the Great Recession in terms of the way capital is distributed in this country, bank consolidations and so forth, to where we really were in 2020 when this hit. There had just been a decade of changes in the way small businesses get access to capital. And so when you put a government program like PPP on top of that financial system, you very clearly recognize where the gaps are. And unfortunately, it took this crisis to reveal that. But as Stephen said, there's a bit of a silver lining in that people are aware of these challenges now and now seem to want to change policy, investment behaviors to address them.
Well, Didier, let me turn to you. And Joe touched on this in terms of relationship between government, small business, and the communities. And I wonder if you could just talk to us about, what has that been like as what was it like as we entered the pandemic, and now that we've had 15 months of the pandemic and seen it play out as it has, what would you say is the kind of vision, that maybe new vision that's born from that?
Thanks, Don, and delighted to be on the panel. I'd like to maybe answer your last question along with the one you just posed. As Stephen said at the outset, Main Street Alliance has been working directly with small businesses to re-envision our economy. To your question, in the last round, we shouldn't conflate the can-do, roll up your sleeves attitude of small business owners with a sense of indifference or even disdain toward government support. COVID-19 forced prolonged lockdowns, temporary business closures that in many cases became permanent, and frankly, on-the-fly adaptive measures taken by small business owners to keep their employees on the payroll as well as healthy and safe. Especially during this pandemic, small businesses recognize and understand how government leaning in versus stepping back can mean the difference between making it to the other side or watching their lifelong dreams slip away through no fault of their own. On the role of government, only public health institutions could provide guidance on how to safely reopen in a uniform way. Only economic development agencies at the federal, state, and local levels could inject critical lifelines in the form of grants and forgivable loans to keep small businesses afloat. And only government resources on the ground could provide needed information and technical assistance on how to access relief. That said, the pandemic response exposed clear systemic barriers to things like capital access and equity that only government can address and rectify. There are a number of facts that bear repeating and reminding ourselves as we look ahead to building the kind of economy that is resilient and sustainable. First, 99.9% of all businesses are small businesses. Second, the average number of employees in a small business is about 10. Third, the small business sector employs nearly half of the entire US private workforce. And fourth, over the course of 2 decades between 2000 and 2018, small businesses created 9.6 million net new jobs, while large businesses created 5.2 million. Small businesses, in fact, account for 2/3 of net new jobs in the United States. All of these statistics simply prove that small business is the true engine of the American economy, which means in times of crisis, government should be doing more, not less, to support and prop up small businesses. Also, as Stephen said, small business is the most trusted institution in America, which underscores how deeply woven it is in the fabric of our communities across the country. Small business thrives because of consumer support and spending, which then in turn boosts local economies and long-term growth. So the real obstacle, in my view, to this vision and making this vision a reality is frankly perception. While small business owners want to succeed, they also care deeply about their workers, their customers, and their communities. The sooner our policymakers grasp where small businesses really are and how they really think, the sooner we can build a kind of economy that benefits not just small business, but everyone.
Thanks, Didier. Let me ask Olay, you're a small business owner. And congratulations, first of all, for surviving these last few months. I think the statistics I've seen include information that as much as 1/3 of businesses that were open in early 2020 are still not open, and so you've managed. And what was your relationship like before the pandemic with government? And what were your expectations when the pandemic hit? And what did you actually receive in terms of support? Was it helpful?
My relationship with local government or just government in general was, honestly, I felt like there was a disconnect as far as communication. I think local and government in general miss the mark with communicating with, small businesses that have been around for 10, 20, 30 plus years, but still provide employment or provide, resources to their community. But during the pandemic, I feel like, again, government missed the mark by connecting with small businesses. I think the generality is it's a very standard message. It's a one size fits all type of message, but then the different types of sizes of businesses, especially smaller businesses, the resources didn't meet the needs of the small businesses. That brings in like local entities and local organizations to step in and create funding. I mean, what helped us, my small business and other small businesses locally, was our own community created a fundraising campaign. So created like a capital campaign, and then a local nonprofit business organization helped determine which small business would get that grant access to the capital. So the whole PPP initiative and loans, was great, but again, it was a one size fits all, and it was only accessible to larger businesses that had, an accounting department that could communicate almost the jargon that was provided to get access to the capital.
How are you doing now, Olay? Are you seeing a light at the end of the tunnel? Are things easing up?
Well, my small business relies on events, so, gatherings. So with the fact that we're not able to have those types of gatherings on a, consistent and like weekly basis, our business definitely took a big hit. The event industry really took a big hit. You have, wedding planners, you have, lighting specialists that create the ambiance for spaces that aren't able to provide their service and keep their, their large teams employed. So they have, essentially have to pivot. For us, our work is very seasonal. So, it's based off of, what season we're in. All are like in December during like our seasonal Santa celebration. We weren't able to provide, the photography for those types of services. So I had to pivot and just focus on more commercial type portraits to existing businesses that are able to still take on customers. So essentially, we're able to weather the storm because, there are businesses that are still able to weather the storm that we're partnering with to provide photography for. But in general, like, I think the whole, the climate of business has definitely changed. And there are a large amount of businesses that can't provide their services because of, they're adhering to CDC guidelines with not, contributing to creating these gatherings, but then at the same time, they're taking the hit because they can't provide their service.
Thanks for sharing that. Joe, we've heard about access to capital and issues of communications. You've worked with and looked at different government programs at the city and local level as well. And can you talk about some of the best practices that you've seen, and especially in addressing inequities and some of the problems that we've heard about?
Sure. So much of what this year has been about is delivering relief to small businesses so that they can cover their payroll, their rent, their other fixed expenses, essentially helping them bridge to the other side. This was really the thrust of the federal response through the Paycheck Protection Program mainly. And in April of 2020, there was this question of how do you move this amount of money from the government to small businesses? And Treasury and SBA decided to work through the financial system for purposes of really scale and speed. But there were serious problems in terms of access to the Paycheck Protection Program, especially the first round of the program. And this was particularly challenging for the smallest small businesses, so those with fewer than 10 employees. These businesses didn't have formal relationships with banks and other large financial institutions or law firms or the accountants. And these were really the kind of private sector institutions that were getting the word out about PPP, right? Because they were delivering services to help small businesses obtain these loans, but there was not a lot of built-in local capacity to bridge this gap between businesses who traditionally have been served well by what I'll call mainstream organizations, like, again, larger banks, even kind of traditional economic development organizations. Their focus has historically not been on very, very small businesses, minority-owned businesses, micro businesses. And so the best responses required essentially new types of partnerships between city government, county government, state government sometimes, the lending institutions that did have relationships with underserved communities like community development financial institutions, certainly the community-based nonprofits that are embedded in neighborhoods and work with small business owners on various issues, and then larger economic development organizations and chambers of commerce. Those were the networks that really came together to deliver, I think, three things to complement some of the shortcomings with the federal government's response. The first was getting the word out through a diverse set of communication streams that reached as many businesses as possible. So this was about awareness building among small business owners that, like I said, didn't have pre-existing relationships with banks and law firms and accountants. But so this had to go through other channels. Obviously, the language in which that outreach occurred was very, very important for non-native English speakers who own businesses. So that was one. Second is these strategies often provided navigators to provide practical guidance to small business owners to help them apply for relief and then try to get that relief forgiven, which is, like an earlier panelist said, filled with jargon and technicalities and just required paperwork that somebody, if you didn't have an accounting department, people needed help. So that was the second area. And then third, again, there was an example referenced earlier, basically injecting more accessible capital into local communities, either through grants or forgivable loans, just as a complement to the Paycheck Protection Program. So there were a lot of local and state-run small business relief programs that explicitly set criteria around either business size, going after the smallest businesses, or neighborhood, going after those that have been neglected by financial institutions over the past couple of decades. And so the outreach here was not perfect, but it had to basically be created on the fly. And I think it got better over time. So, spring into summer into fall. And I think the question going forward is, what do these networks do now? They did all this outreach to small businesses. They kind of learned anew what some of the challenges were. And now there are actually some institutional partnerships that could be brought to bear on helping small business recover and thrive, not just from COVID, but just in general. And so I think that'll be a really interesting dynamic to watch, is how do these coalitions that got brought together during COVID, how do they stick together to work with and through small businesses to improve our communities and our economy as a whole.
Joe, do local governments, whether city or county, do they have departments or agencies who, with small business experts or liaison people or people who are doing research and really trying to learn and know about their small business community?
Some do. I would say most cities and local governments, just due to the size of most local governments, do not have that capacity in-house, but rather rely on other nonprofits or the National Network of Small Business Development Centers. The larger cities, they do have explicit programming and technical assistance that work with small businesses, either to understand government regulations around things like permitting and zoning, or to provide access to, like I said, this practical assistance. So they kind of are brokers between small business providers, both nonprofit and private providers, and small businesses themselves. So you see cities sometimes have like a small business council or advisory group that tries to kind of raise issues and, you know, serve as a broker within the community. But your typical economic development operation at the local level has historically been more about kind of delivering tools that help businesses get tax relief. So, you know, helping a business get a property tax abatement or some other economic development incentive. And those tended to go to larger businesses rather than these very, very small businesses that we're talking about today. So it did exist in some cases, but it was kind of rare, actually, just in the way that economic development has historically been oriented towards larger businesses.
Thanks. Natasha, as president of the local chamber in Richmond, you are in conversation with a lot of small businesses, minority businesses, and among them. And just wonder, you know, what they've told you about what really good support looks like. And I'm assuming that there was some, and you know, what do you think that, you know, are the lessons from COVID that from the pandemic that you hope that can draw on?
Sure. Yeah. So the COVID crisis really showed and exacerbated the pre-existing barriers to capital for small businesses. You know, this includes small business redlining, usury credit rates, lack of other supports and technical assistance that's really needed for small businesses to launch and grow successfully. And these barriers especially harm minority-owned, women-owned micro businesses, rural businesses as well. And so, for Main Street to see that type of prosperity after COVID, it's going to depend on a couple of things. Small business owners need to have the ability to compete with big business for talent for their staff, and then also, and this is important, the aggregate demand. People in their communities need to have enough disposable income, right, to spend on local businesses. And so for that reason, Main Street businesses, businesses of the chamber, businesses that I speak to daily, they definitely support these types of robust safety nets and investments in their communities. So things like healthcare, childcare, paid leave, and having corporations pay their fair share so we can actually invest in these programs will be key.
Well, let me ask Didier, you know, the report, as Stephen outlined, is an initial report of sorts with initial findings, and suggested that more digging needs to be done. If you were to pick just a couple areas of findings from the report that you would probe much more deeply, what would they be and why?
Thanks for the question, Don. Given the urgency of a COVID response for small business, there were naturally missteps, as Joseph described, during a rushed implementation of new programs. And so with each successive change or update from Congress and the regulatory agency at hand, we at Main Street Alliance have tried to inform small business owners of what is available now, which programs are coming online soon, and lastly, when new guidance for programmatic updates is published and being made available by those relevant agencies. However, identifying gaps is not enough. I truly believe that government agencies would be well served in doing their own retrospective and conducting a comprehensive review of what worked well and what didn't during the course of the pandemic, so that lessons learned can be proactively applied to improving both existing and new programs. And one area that I would point out is, and it's referenced in the report, is the prioritization of quality data collection and disaggregation. I think it's imperative that agencies make transparency and evaluation a pillar of all of these programs, because that will only strengthen the effectiveness of their design and delivery in the future. Joseph also mentioned some of the problems in reaching both communities of color and frankly, communities that don't register on the map for government at all levels. The American Rescue Plan that was enacted in March authorized a new small business community navigator pilot program that will attempt to improve awareness, education, and technical assistance in hard-to-reach communities. So the Navigator program could serve as a litmus test for how well government is getting information out to those who need it the most.
Great. Olay, we know that immigrants tend to start businesses at a very high rate, relatively high rate. They were, I think, among the hardest hit too in the pandemic. I wonder if you could share a little bit about your own sort of how you became a business owner, and then what you see, perhaps, role of government in supporting particularly immigrant-owned businesses and special needs or situations that would be helpful to businesses started by foreign-born population.
So, I own my own photography studio in downtown Lancaster here. But prior to owning my own business, I worked for a national portrait studio in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and then transferred to Beltsville, Maryland, and worked in the DC area as a photo manager. Well, one thing I recognize is that, as an individual in the workforce, you could only go up so high in employment. So being an entrepreneur was the best way for me to, achieve my goals as far as, hitting the salary amount that I needed to make for myself, because, government's not doing enough to help increase salaries for individuals that want to stay as employees. So, being an entrepreneur is very rewarding, and I think, that's why a lot of people end up starting their own small businesses, because of the fact that government is not doing enough to support individuals that want to continue to be employees, and still, provide for their community by being employees. Being an employee is an important role, and people need to recognize that. But being an entrepreneur is very rewarding because it helps you achieve the goals that you're looking for, in a faster pace. But from the January 20th, 2020 census reported that approximately 18% were minority owned. From that, 577,835 were Asian owned. What that data is really saying is government should do more to help increase the percentage of minority owned businesses. Something that they could potentially do, creating equitable resources so that minority individuals will learn the pathway to be entrepreneurs. Because there are resources currently out there right now, but of course it's all in English. So it's like, how do we see the value of minority-owned businesses, but we're not encouraging more minorities to pursue entrepreneurship and have the ability to own their own business.
Joe, I want to ask you a little further about the vision, and how do we go then move from this relief approach that we've been in, relief approach to government, to a different vision? And maybe you could put it in a little bit of a historical context. I'm not sure what the direction of the economic development programs have been like across the country, but where do you see that moving, and how can we go from relief to being, as one of the panelists said, really proactive support and help for small businesses?
I think that's exactly the question we should be asking right now. We are in the next several months, it might be summer, might be fall, maybe it'll take a little bit longer depending on what happens with the virus. We're going to kind of leave this relief stage and move into a recovery stage, and there's going to be overlap between those two. But I think for the recovery, we should really be setting twin objectives in terms of what kind of outcomes we want to deliver as a country by working with and through small businesses. I think the first outcome is really about the labor market. Is that whether it's a local, regional, state strategy or for the federal government, is that we should really be trying to help small businesses start and grow to help them create family sustaining jobs. That's really the most important thing in terms of having a quality recovery. The challenge pre-COVID was we had plentiful work, but work that was not delivering livable conditions for too many people. And so we have to work at kind of creating family sustaining jobs. The second objective in terms of working with and through small businesses is to do so in a way that we are enhancing racial equity and building community wealth in underserved neighborhoods. So this is really about acknowledging what Olay just said, which is that entrepreneurial ability is spread quite evenly across every demographic group, every geography. The evidence is pretty clear on that. But people of color own employer businesses at much lower rates than their share of the population. That's not because there's not interest or ability. In fact, there's been a lot of growth in that part of the entrepreneurship space over the last decade or two, partly as the country diversifies and partly just as a result of the economic mobility of those groups. But what I take away from that statistic is that kind of the yoke of our legacy of discrimination and segregation and the way that entrepreneurs access the resources to start and grow businesses is inhibiting the ability of those groups to reach their productive potential as small business owners. And that puts a cap on job creation, it puts a cap on innovation, and it is just unjust in addition to all those things. So I would like to see those two objectives be the conditions for any sort of big change in the small business system. But I think once you've got that roadmap, you can work backwards to really evolve economic development in the United States away from this focus on attracting large businesses from one city to another through tax breaks and towards working to support businesses or potential entrepreneurs that are already in your community. I think that's going to involve really three things. One is new types of capital provision. So I think the federal government has to think much more about how its own lending works with micro businesses. Online lenders have become very, very important for that business segment, but oftentimes is operating in a kind of a predatory manner. So how do we utilize technology to get capital into the hands of entrepreneurs, but do so in a way that is kind of fair to them and sets them up for success? I think that's going to have to involve partnerships with CDFIs, as I talked about earlier. That's one. Two is I think that as the business community makes a lot of sets a lot of goals and makes a lot of statements about racial equity, I think holding major corporations and anchor institutions to account for how they're thinking about their suppliers and whether they're kind of providing opportunities for small businesses through their supply chains or their procurement policies. That's something that government can influence, but it's going to require behavior change on the part of corporate America and through large anchor institutions like government, like universities, like medical systems. And then third is I think entrepreneurship, you learn a lot by doing and you learn a lot from others. So how can we make investments locally that build up these ecosystems that make that kind of knowledge transfer easier? You see this a lot in the tech small business ecosystem, lots of exchange between entrepreneurs, lots of incentives to do that. I think you see it in other parts of the economy too, but we could do a better job resourcing that collectively. I think that's a role for government. It's kind of a public good to think about how information moves and how entrepreneurs get access to that information. And we'd all be better off, I think, if that was a more seamless flow. So I'd like to see some resources put towards that.
Thank you, Joe. Natasha, can you talk about in your community, business community, I imagine the number of small businesses have closed and many are struggling, and have large companies come in and taken over in some cases where the small businesses were? What is the relationship? And Joe referred to the question of large companies and really even a responsibility that is shoulder in terms of making sure that small businesses are also receiving contracts and are part of the supply chains. And I think there's some concern now, of course, that with so many small businesses having gone under, that large companies will come in and fill the void, and it will make it even tougher for smaller businesses. And I wonder what you've seen in your community, and if people have been concerned about that, and if they're addressing that in some way.
Definitely, Don. So recently here, we had Amazon. They're building a new facility that's going to deal with robotics. And they were given the red carpet treatment, right, as all big businesses are. And so especially in this COVID reality, small businesses look at that and they say, what about us? Where's our relief? Where's our assistance? Because we know that Amazon coming into our area means that they're not paying the same taxes that we are. They're not going to be invested in the community the same way that we are. And so it's really troubling for small businesses in my area to see that happen right in front of us when we are hurting and businesses have closed. So that's definitely something that we're dealing with now. And it's unfortunate, right? Trying to convey that message that we all businesses, and especially true small businesses, minority-owned small businesses who have been left out for, forever, essentially, still not being able to have that same access, right? That access to capital, that access to the benefits of being a big business, that access to talent, right? This Amazon warehouse is going to hire 1,000 people, they say. And so that's 1,000 people taken out of our true small businesses pool of talent, where we would be able to provide, the benefits that we want to, the life work balance that we want to, truly helping the communities that we serve. But those options are given to big business instead. And so it's really it's just really unfortunate.
DDA, Small Business Administration, and has all of a sudden gotten a outsized amount of work, and volume of loans and activity is unprecedented, of course. And what's your sense of what its priorities are have been like, and what would you recommend, and what would you hope to see the Small Business Administration really do more of?
Thanks, Don. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's often easy to forget to take a pause and to reflect on the inordinate amount of extra work and responsibility and authority that was put on the SBA at the beginning of the pandemic, as Joseph mentioned, through the establishment of the PPP and other new programs since. In fact, just last week, we saw the launch of 2 new grant programs for hard-hit industries, shuttered venues and restaurants in particular. So until we reach that point of actually pivoting to recovery, I fully expect that SBA will continue to be stretched to its limits. So, I would love to see, again, SBA at some point soon take a look back, see what was effective as part of building out all of these programs, but also go even further back to before the pandemic and combine some of the back then newer programs around microloans and access to capital, and see if there's a way to thread the needle as far as which programs may have been working well prior to COVID, and which programs have been more successful than others during COVID. I'd also like to see SBA partner with other agencies. For instance, the Department of Commerce has the Minority Business Development Agency that is supposed to center on minority-owned businesses. Are there ways for agencies that maybe traditionally don't work together regularly to combine forces and to do that systematic review collaboratively, and I would say in coordination and engagement with outside stakeholders like small business owners themselves. And then if I can just circle back to what you asked earlier in terms of what is still needed for long-term recovery, I think Joseph and Natasha really hit it on the head, but I would just underscore the fact that we saw widening income inequality in this country before COVID that has only been further expanded during COVID, whether it's looking at the collective wealth of American billionaires jumping 55% over the course of 14 months, or whether it's looking at America's 719 billionaires having 4 times more money than 165 million of the least wealthy Americans. That is a serious problem that only government can begin to address through rewriting the rules of the road for the U.S. tax code by closing loopholes for corporations and wealthy Americans, and also on the regulatory side, beefing up enforcement of tax laws at the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS has been bludgeoned in recent years in terms of its budget and its capacity to do effective tax enforcement. So we need to invest in the agencies that are responsible for making sure that corporations and wealthy Americans pay their fair share.
Okay, thanks. I know we're nearing the end of our time, but I'm just going to make one final round of questions to each panelist. Let's start with Joe. Joe, is there a city or local area that you would hold out as a example where things really did work pretty well in terms of government, business, and community in terms of the response, and that you think would be good to apply, in a lot of places?
Yeah, I think of a couple of examples. I think one was, if it kind of depends on what metric you want to use. The metric that I was looking at was, where were local relief efforts addressing the systemic inequalities that we're talking about? And so I actually looked at some of the outcomes that Akron, Ohio has been able to achieve, really through kind of simple types of partnerships and outreach efforts that intentionally diversified how messages were getting out, who was delivering those messages. Very intentional opportunity, or very intentional effort to like engage the Black community in Akron. And as a result, if you looked at their local relief that the city and the county put forward, just overwhelmingly populated with minority-owned businesses. And when you ask them, well, why do you think that was? I think they say two things. One is that there had been an ongoing shift among city, county government, and the kind of larger chamber of commerce to focus on addressing racial disparities broadly. So they had brought in folks to work in those institutions that had good community connectivity, meaning they could reach neighborhoods and kind of Main Street businesses that previously were not really engaged in those either governments or intermediaries. And then two, they just had something that was very easy to access. They were just giving out, capital that didn't have a lot of strings attached to it. And it was pretty easy for businesses to, get that capital. And so I think between those two things, there's a couple of lessons learned. One is that, simplicity helps in terms of accessibility. And two, who's leading really matters and who they are connected to. So I would just offer that up as one example.
Thanks, Joe. Olay, what will you be doing differently now that you've learned as much as you have the pandemic in terms of engagement with government and community people?
So, what I would like to do and will be doing differently, and I'm already continuing to do right now, is, connect with minority-owned businesses that have been in our community for 30 plus years. I am trying to meet them, where they want to be met. So it's, either going to their place of business and actually just acknowledging that, yes, you've been here for 30 years, and I want to say thank you for, for being the building block for my specific business, because without their guidance within the community, even though they've been very silent while they've been building their business, they've been there and they're still existing in that same location for the past 30, plus years. I think I have to do the work on my end, and then I'm going to hold, our local governments, our local agencies accountable to do the same thing, because clearly we have examples of, we're celebrating white businesses that have been in existence for 50 to 100 plus years. But what about, the minority-owned businesses that have been in our community for 30 plus years? They're not getting any recognition. And, when we're talking about, there are ways for businesses to take advantage of funding, and you wonder why these businesses aren't taking advantage of it, it's because nobody's been communicating with them for the past 30 years. So what do you expect, So I think what I'm going to do differently is actually going to these businesses and just saying thank you for being here and being the building block to our community, and then going to our local agencies to say you need to go and speak to them directly. You can't have me be the liaison for you, because that doesn't create transparency and that doesn't create trust, because trust gets built once you actually get to know the person.
Thanks. And finally, let me ask Natasha real quickly, in terms of your priorities and how the pandemic has changed that, if it has. What will you be prioritizing say in the next year?
I think just as an overall priority, especially for not just myself, but for my local government, I really want to push for us to start looking beyond short-term profits and really start making those investments that can create sustainable workplaces and better economies for ourselves. Small businesses, we employ nearly half of our working families in our local communities. We're innovators, we're problem solvers. We invest twice as much in our communities compared to Walmarts and Amazons. And so I am, and I also want to encourage my local government to start looking closely at small businesses and empowering true small businesses to better take care of our communities.
Thanks, Natasha. Well, let me just thank each of our panelists for their insights and to share their experience and recommendations. I've learned quite a bit, and I'm sure our listeners have too. So let me just take this back to Stephen.
Thanks so much, Don, and thank you, Natasha McKellar and Olay and Joseph and Didier. Just a great conversation. Clearly there's a lot of work to do still, and we have both the opportunity and need desperately right now to work with small businesses and the government to create more programs to get us through this still challenging time. But really, as we look towards the future, we have an opportunity to build a really strong, inclusive, equitable, and sustainable, resilient economy. And I think coming out of from this discussion, we've got really some great feedback, and we've got some things that we can continue to dig in more. So thank you all so much for the conversation today. Thank you for everybody who tuned in. We encourage you to download the report and check it out if you haven't. And please reach out to any of us if you want to dig into things a little bit more. Thank you all so much. Have a good day.